This is a hotly debated topic, the discussion around the auctioning of sports watches. When I think auction, I normally think antique, I normally think provenance, I think one-off. There are some amazing examples of watches that have been auctioned off in the past. For example, the latest Patek Philippe, one of the most complicated Grandmaster chimes ever made, in steel with a salmon dial. Fantastic story, and all of the proceeds going to a charity. Very interesting. We look into the realms of Rolex watches and we note that there are some incredible pieces that have been auctioned off in the past. Antiques, pocket watches, you name it. And then we get into the realms of steel sports watches. Now we've noted that steel sports watch collecting has exploded over the last 5-10 years. And specific sports models go for more money than others. The thought today was to kind of quantify this point and make this a discussion and a bit of a debate around what is perceived as valuable in this sphere. And what I've done is pulled up 3 separate auction results for 3 separate watches from 3 separate occasions, run through each of them, explain the background, the story behind them, and try to explain what happened. The first watch, one that is the most famous that everyone knows about, the Paul Newman Daytona. Is the story behind this watch and the auction results and everything else justified behind this piece? I absolutely agree that it does. Purely because of the history, the background, the owner, what this watch meant in the sphere of steel watch collecting. And if you'd like more information about that, I will link to a video discussing the Rolex Daytona and just why it is considered overhyped and overrated. This watch pretty much perpetuated the trend to collect steel sports watches. So for that reason, the price that it was sold for is pretty well justified. Another small detail is that it is in superb condition. It's been looked after, it's been well polished, it's presented in a gorgeous way. So for that reason, the Paul Newman Daytona does deserve attention for what it is. The next watch on the list is the Marlon Brando Apocalypse Now GMT. Now this watch also has a great provenance, has a great amount of history. Worn by Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now. It's a watch that's been used in film, but especially, like the Paul Newman Daytona, it has an engraving in the back. Private engraving done by Brando himself. So immediately this watch has a little bit of a standing. It has something else to it. This whole idea of taking the bezel off a GMT, we would kind of think whether or not this would be a trend, whether or not this would become a popular thing, but it didn't seem like it started much of a movement. This watch is quite unique to itself. Once again, the condition is immaculate. The watch is clean, it's gorgeous. Really well finished, well looked after, besides the fact that it isn't supplied on a bracelet. If I'm not mistaken, these rubber straps were supplied with Rolex watches back in the day. So it is period correct for what it is. So what we can chalk up when we see them both, the Paul Newman Daytona, the Brando GMT. Both of these watches have been owned by prominent figures in the film industry. Both of them have a bit of a history, the one appearing in a film, the other perpetuating the trend for steel watch collecting. Both of them deserve the prices they went for. They have quite a presence, they have an image behind them, very interesting story and background. Then we jump to a watch that I consider to be the most ridiculous steel sports Rolex watch to have ever been sold at auction. I'm sure there are more. This piece got a lot of attention and deserves a bit of coverage because it contrasts directly against the other 2 that we just looked at. This Submariner, yes it is a Rolex Submariner, is a reference 6538. So it's a big crown Submariner, very similar to the model that James Bond wore in the original films. But this reference is quite special in a few ways. It has a Explorer dial. The printing on the dial has red text involved. It's 200 meters first as opposed to feet first. So there are these small little inaccuracies that this model has that has made it unique. Adding to that, the watch doesn't have a bezel. It doesn't have an original bracelet. The NATO strap is undersized and the watch looks like it's been put through a mixer. This watch sold for over $1 million at auction. And at the time when it was sold, I don't know if that's been changed since, it is the most expensive Submariner to ever sell at auction. And let's just be frank, this is ridiculous when you consider where the other 2 watches stand, what they sold for, in contrast to this watch. Where this watch doesn't have any provenance. Yes, it's unique in the way it presents itself, but it doesn't have any kind of background. It hasn't been well maintained or looked after. it looks like something that's just been assembled from spare parts. What's interesting is that when we compare the sale of this watch compared to the sale of the Paul Newman, of the Brando, you hear the feedback that's sort of shared between the groups. There was so much feedback on the Paul Newman sale. A lot of people were very impressed. It was quite the landslide moment. A lot of story behind it and made for a great story. You look at the Brando watch, personally I expected it to go for more than just shy of $2 million because it has a great story, has a great presence. And then we jump to the Submariner and just see the divide in the audience and the feedback. Some saying, what a piece of junk. What's the deal with that strap? It's official now that the vintage market has lost its mind. Some are saying it's a junk shop watch, that they've fished out better things from a garbage disposal. So it is a very divisive subject to discuss. And again, it is just ludicrous. The more these steel sports watches are sold and given this praise and provenance, the more desirable they have become. And then it's when it gets too far that people start sitting back and saying, what is going on? So it's food for thought. You see the sale of some that have amazing provenance, and then you see some that have been sold on a whim, almost by chance, for a ridiculous amount of money that, quite frankly, doesn't seem warranted in the scheme of things. Of course, this is all open to debate, and it is a very divisive subject, so hearing your feedback on the subject would be great. It's kind of like when collecting and when the vintage charm goes too far, when the appeal really goes out of control. It's such a strange and divisive subject, because again, when we think of auctions, we think of that provenance, we think of well-maintained, gorgeous-looking watches. Seeing something like this that has been molested, damaged, still going for ridiculous amounts of money, it's a very peculiar thing. This whole field is all dependent on hype, on advertising. Of course, when you're in the room during the auction, it means something. There are so many other stories about these pieces that have sold before, so it would be nice to, in the future, look at them in more detail. But the main subject of this video was to focus on the Big Crown Submariner and contrasting it to the likes of a popular watch that has just sold recently, the Brando piece and the Paul Newman Daytona. But it makes you question, where are we going? What is going to happen to this scene? Is this just going to perpetuate into the future? Or will we see a decline? It's ludicrous to consider that these watches were just watches back in the day. Now they're being heralded as some of the most important pieces to collecting. And when you see examples like the Submariner sell for the amount that it did, it makes you question a lot of things. Whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, I leave that up to you.